What happens when fashion's next big thing disappears before the world even notices she's gone? In the early 90s, Beverly Peele was unstoppable. She was walking for Chanel at 15, landing Vogue covers at 16, and closing Versace shows before most girls her age had even graduated. But behind the flashbulbs and designer gowns, something was already unraveling. One moment, she was everywhere. The next, forgotten. There were whispers, a teenage pregnancy, industry silence, a lawsuit that no one wanted to report on. The kind of story fashion doesn't like to tell, because it exposes the side of modeling no one wants to talk about. So why did Beverly Peele vanish? And what does her disappearance say about the industry that once called her a star? It all started in Los Angeles, with a girl who grew up fast, worked harder, and still wasn't allowed to stay.
Honestly, it was one of those things that just happened. It wasn't a thought. There was no process. There was no plan, no 5-year, 10-year, 2-year plan. It was just, I was in school and my mom put me in etiquette because I was a tomboy. And that just evolved, and I was in a competition, and next thing I know, my first job, Johnny Versace.
Beverly Peele wasn't discovered on a beach or in a mall. She didn't win a contest or get scouted at a concert. She walked straight into the industry with the kind of energy that couldn't be staged, tall, striking, and already aware of how to hold her own. Born in Los Angeles in 1975, she started modeling at just 12 years old. By 13, she was booking jobs. And by 14, she'd already graced the pages of Elle and Mademoiselle. This wasn't just an early start. It was a full-speed launch. She didn't come from money. She wasn't part of the New York fashion scene or the European elite. But she had something the industry couldn't look away from, and they didn't. She signed with Elite Model Management, the same powerhouse agency behind Cindy, Naomi, and Linda. But Beverly didn't look like anyone else. Her face was youthful, but sharp. Her walk was already fierce, and there was a certain edge to her. The kind that came from navigating the world as a black teenager in a space still dominated by white faces. By 15, she was walking for Chanel in Paris. Karl Lagerfeld, who rarely placed newcomers in his shows, gave her a spot on his runway. At 16, she landed a Vogue cover. The fashion world moved quickly in the 90s, but Beverly was moving faster. Her timing was almost mythical. This was the era of supermodels turning into celebrities, of Versace runways packed with stars, of music videos and magazine covers that turned models into household names. And here was Beverly, barely old enough to drive, closing shows for Gianni Versace, shooting with Richard Avedon, and appearing on the same covers as women 10 years older. The industry couldn't get enough of her. She had the kind of look that could shift easily from high fashion to streetwear, elegant, commercial, editorial, whatever the job called for. She shot campaigns for Donna Karan and Mugler, appeared in Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. She was everywhere. But it wasn't just the bookings. It was the promise. Beverly was being positioned as the next supermodel. And not quietly. She was often called the new Naomi Campbell, a comparison that said more about the industry's limited imagination than it did about Beverly herself, because Beverly wasn't trying to be anyone else. She was just trying to work. The truth is, she didn't have time to dream of modeling. She was already too busy doing it. While most girls her age were navigating high school, Beverly was navigating international flights, last-minute bookings, and back-to-back fashion weeks. She grew up on planes and in casting rooms. Beverly was fortunate early on. People in the industry took her under their wing, protecting her from many of the dangers that plagued young models. But that protection came with a price. She was still just a teenager expected to behave like a seasoned professional, living in an adult world that would later show its true face. And still, she kept showing up, kept delivering, and kept working. At 17, she became the youngest model to ever sign an exclusive contract with Ralph Lauren. That kind of deal was reserved for legends. Beverly was still in high school. From the outside, it looked like everything was falling into place. Covers, campaigns, big names, big paychecks. But even then, Beverly's story wasn't following the usual script. At first, she had people looking out for her, agents who kept her safe from the worst parts of the business. But that kind of protection doesn't last forever. As her star rose, so did the pressure. She was being booked everywhere, pushed further with every success, with no one asking how much she could handle. Because Beverly Peele was supposed to be the next Naomi, the next Iman, the next face of the future. But what happens when you become the future too soon, and the industry decides it isn't ready for you after all? In 1993, most 17-year-olds were thinking about graduation. Beverly Peele was working for Chanel and Ralph Lauren, flying between cities, and building a career that didn't seem to have a ceiling. But then she found out she was pregnant. In any other industry, this might have been handled with discretion, maybe some time off, a quiet return when she was ready. But fashion doesn't work that way. Fashion has rules that nobody writes down, but everybody follows. And one of those rules is simple. Pregnancy ends careers. The phone call stopped. Not all at once, but just enough for her team to notice. Bookings dried up. Brands were suddenly going in another direction. Beverly's team tried to spin it. Maybe they could shoot around it. Maybe she could work until she was showing. Maybe the industry would make an exception for someone as successful as Beverly. But the industry doesn't make exceptions. It makes examples. The fashion world had spent 2 years selling Beverly as the embodiment of youth and freedom. Magazine covers had positioned her as the girl who could do anything. But when she made a choice that required the industry to see her as a full human being, not just a face and a body, they couldn't handle it. The whispers started immediately. Industry gossip travels fast, and Beverly's pregnancy became the kind of story that people discussed in hushed tones over lunch. Not with concern for her well-being, with concern for her marketability. As if becoming a mother had somehow made her less valuable as a person. What made it worse was the timing. Beverly had been positioned as the next generation. But she was still a teenager, without the leverage Naomi had spent years building. The industry's response was brutal in its efficiency. Beverly wasn't blacklisted. That would have been too obvious. She was simply forgotten. Her name stopped appearing on casting lists. Her agent stopped returning calls as quickly. The machine that had lifted her up so fast was now pretending she had never existed. And Beverly? She made the choice to keep her baby. In a world that had never given her real choices about anything, where to live, how to work, what to wear, this was one decision that was entirely hers. But fashion punished her for it. The daughter she gave birth to in 1993 was beautiful and healthy. Beverly named her Cairo, but the industry that had once called Beverly the future wasn't interested in her comeback story. They were already moving on to the next face, the next 17-year-old who could fill the gap Beverly had left behind. The hypocrisy was staggering. This was the same industry that celebrated girl power, yet dropped her the moment she made a choice for herself. When Beverly came back after giving birth, she was still young, still striking, still ready to work. But everything had shifted. The industry that once sold her as the future now saw her as a complication. Bookings trickled in. Smaller jobs, regional campaigns, editorial filler instead of prime covers. Not because Beverly lacked talent, but because the industry had already moved on. And the saddest part? Beverly was still just 18 years old, an age when most people are just figuring out who they are. And fashion had already decided she didn't matter. The girl who'd been branded the next Naomi was quietly erased, not through scandal or disgrace, but through something colder: indifference. Fashion had taken what it needed from Beverly Peele. And then, without warning, it let her fall. But what happens when the only world you've ever known decides you're disposable, and you still believe you can fight your way back? Through the late 90s and into the 2000s, she kept working. But the work was different now. Smaller campaigns, regional brands, the kind of jobs that paid the bills but didn't make headlines. Beverly had gone from closing Versace shows to shooting catalog spreads, from Vogue covers to department store ads. The industry had a way of managing former stars. Give them just enough work to keep them quiet, but not enough to remind people of what they used to be. Beverly was being managed out of relevance, one booking at a time. The financial reality was harsh. Modeling looks glamorous from the outside, but the money isn't as steady as people think, especially when you're no longer the girl everyone wants to book. Beverly had earned well during her peak years, but she'd also been supporting herself since she was 12. And now, with a daughter to raise, the pressure was different. She tried to reinvent herself. Different looks, different markets, different approaches. But the fashion world had already decided who Beverly Peele was, and more importantly, who she wasn't. She wasn't the next Naomi anymore. She was a former model trying to stay relevant in a business that worshipped youth above everything else. The pressure was taking its toll. Beverly later spoke openly about how the dark side of the fashion world had nearly derailed her career. The hard partying, the substances, the loss of control that came with being so young in such an adult industry. She was struggling not just professionally but personally, trying to find herself in a world that had never given her the chance to simply be a teenager. Then, in 2010, another crisis hit. Beverly was driving with her daughter Cairo when they were involved in a serious car accident that left them both hospitalized. The trauma alone would have been enough, but what followed made everything worse. The other party filed a lawsuit, and Beverly responded with her own, alleging the car had malfunctioned. The legal fight dragged on for years, while media coverage turned cruel, focusing more on her past than the actual case. The lawsuit painted Beverly as unstable, unreliable, and dangerous. The same press that had once celebrated her as a rising star was now treating her like a cautionary tale. And Beverly, who had never been given media training or crisis management support, was left to defend herself in a system that seemed designed to tear her down. The financial pressure was mounting: legal fees, medical bills, the cost of simply trying to rebuild her career. It was all adding up. Beverly had gone from making thousands of dollars per day to struggling to pay for basic necessities. In 2014, Beverly did something that most former models would never do. She got honest about her finances. In an interview, she revealed that she was essentially broke, living paycheck to paycheck, struggling to make ends meet. "I'm not ashamed to say I'm broke," she said. "I worked hard for everything I had, and I'm still working hard." It was a stunning admission. The girl who had once been positioned as the future of fashion was now talking about financial survival. But there was something powerful about her honesty. A refusal to pretend that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. The industry's response was predictable: silence. No offers of help, no acknowledgement of how they'd contributed to her situation, no recognition that someone who had made them millions of dollars was now struggling to pay rent. Beverly Peele had been used up by the fashion world and then discarded. But she was still here, still fighting, still trying to build something from the wreckage of what had once been a promising career. The question was, how much more could she endure before she decided to fight back? For decades, Beverly Peele had been quiet about a lot of things. The industry had taught her that silence was survival, that speaking out meant career death, and her career was already hanging by a thread. But by 2020, Beverly had reached a breaking point. The Me Too movement had changed the conversation around powerful men and the women they'd harmed. Stories that had been whispered for years were finally being told out loud. And Beverly realized she had a story that needed to be heard.
Today, in a daytime exclusive, Beverly Peele is speaking out about the violation she says she endured at the hands of Peter Nygard.
In 2021, Beverly filed a civil lawsuit against Peter Nygard, the Canadian fashion executive who had built a billion-dollar business. According to her legal filing, she alleged that Nygard had sexually assaulted her in the early 2000s during a trip to the Bahamas, at a time when she was in her mid-20s and still working to rebuild her modeling career. One of the most personal and painful parts of her claim was the allegation that her son, Trey, had been conceived as a result of that encounter.
This is my first venture out and sharing it, and with the hopes that my story will help other people come forward and, be strong and know that they have a safe haven, a place to go to, and there's people that you can talk to. And, I want to make sure that, and my son is really the reason why I came forward. He's my superhero.
She said she'd raised him for nearly 2 decades without ever speaking publicly about what had happened. The legal documents were precise. Beverly's attorneys described the incident as non-consensual and part of a broader pattern of behavior involving vulnerable young models. Her case wasn't framed as an isolated event, but as one example of a system that had failed to protect women in the industry. Nygard's legal team denied the allegations in full, calling them false and defamatory. The case became part of a much wider legal investigation into Nygard's conduct, with numerous women coming forward to share similar experiences dating back decades. What stood out, though, was the silence that followed, especially from the fashion press. The same magazines that had once put Beverly on their covers barely mentioned her story. Her lawsuit was referenced only briefly in broader articles about Nygard's downfall, treated as a footnote rather than a focal point. It was telling. Beverly had once been famous enough to walk for Versace and front campaigns for Donna Karan. But now, when she was finally speaking her truth, the industry barely acknowledged her at all. And her story wasn't unique. For years, young models, often still teenagers, had been placed in adult situations with no safeguards, no protections, and no one willing to ask hard questions about what happened behind the scenes. People used to say Beverly was one of the lucky ones, that she'd made it, that she'd worked with the best designers, earned good money, built a name for herself. But as she later said, none of that shielded her from exploitation. By the time she came forward, Nygard had already been arrested in 2020 on serious federal charges, including racketeering and sex trafficking. Her allegations were added to a growing body of cases under investigation, part of a larger criminal probe spanning years and multiple countries. Still, Beverly's voice remained largely absent from the headlines. Other women were featured in documentaries, interviewed on national television, seen as key witnesses. Beverly's story, one of the most personal and painful, was rarely given the same visibility. "I'm tired of being silent," she said in one of the few interviews she gave. "People need to know what happened." It took tremendous courage to come forward. Beverly wasn't just risking public scrutiny. She was opening up about something deeply personal, involving her family and her past, knowing full well that she might be dismissed, doubted, or ignored again. But she did it anyway, because, as she said, silence wasn't protection. It was complicity. The industry's response followed a familiar script. They said nothing. No statements of support, no meaningful acknowledgement. The same brands that had once relied on Beverly to sell clothes to millions of people now acted like she didn't exist. The girl who had once been called the future of fashion was now fighting to make sure that future looked different for the next generation of models coming up behind her, even if she had to do it alone. Beverly Peele is still here. She speaks about her children with pride and about survival with the quiet strength of someone who's lived through what most never see. Her story didn't fit the comeback narrative. It wasn't glossy or convenient. It was honest. "I'm still here," she said in a recent interview. "I survived everything they threw at me." And that's exactly what makes her unforgettable.